Good evening, Vice Chair DeLima, board members, Superintendent Kishimoto. I'm Clayton Cunny now, again, from the Pro City Waipahu Complex area, and was the co-chair of the task force for EL learners. So thank you for this opportunity. Before I get started, I really would like to publicly recognize the task force members. So if you can all stand. I wanted to thank them for their expertise, their passion, and their work around EL learners and helping us get through this work together. So like special education, the charge was the same, right? What is the current status of the work we're doing within the state of Hawaii? Looking at our data, looking at our current research, and what are those practices that we want to have, right? And then it was to provide the recommendations to approve the programs and access for ELs statewide. And then to submit the recommendations to the superintendent this evening. So in our theory of action, we really started with, I think you have the full report. So we really started with our individual beliefs around EL learners and ELs and multilingualism, around culture. And from that individual beliefs, the task force worked together, combined it so that it became task force beliefs. And the bullets on our theory of action really is that, our beliefs. From these beliefs, we created our vision and our mission for the task force. And some bright soul on our task force decided if we looked at our beliefs, that really could serve as our theory of action, right? Because if we believe that all English learners are capable of achieving excellence, that success influences the learner's identity, identity influences learning, that multilingualism is an asset for learning and a competitive advantage in future careers. And if we ensure access to equitable education, these are abbreviated, so you have the full ones, that schools create that learning environment responsive to students, and families and communities are a partner, then we can improve achievement, right? Promote global student development and multilingual citizens who positively contribute to society. So that became our theory of action and helped us to guide the work. Along, we looked at our state document. So we looked at the state and Board of Ed strategic plan and what we talked about in terms of equity within there. We also looked at the board policies around multilingualism and also the seal of biliteracy. So that helped to guide the work that we have before us and that we completed. So as our task force got to work, we looked at the data. We created some guiding questions from that data in terms of what we needed to know and what we wanted to improve. And our task force broke up into 3 subgroups. So we had one on language approach, acquisition and approach. We had resources, governance, and organization. So as they did the work and came up with our long-term and short-term recommendations, these were kind of like that cross-cutting themes that drew those recommendations together. That really what we wanted to do is, that we needed to do was, what is our state's approach to multilingualism? How do we identify, develop, and sustain English learner programs, expertise, and quality instructional resources within our system? So when you look at some of our recommendations, it really is about how do we equip our teachers to understand how to work with EL learners, looking at what is the quality curriculum that we have, and how do we move from like English-only approaches to bilingual or multilingualism. And then to develop and sustain a coherent system with processes that support each English learner. So like special education, that need for looking at the data and being able to monitor how students are doing, our EL students are doing. So really looking at that system approach from the state to the complex area and to the schools. So our short-term recommendations, and we kind of defined them as between 1 to 2 years. Is to begin to build that state complex level capacity around English learner expertise, right? To recruit TESOL teachers, TESOL teachers, And knowing that we don't want every teacher to be TESOL teachers or TESOL certified, right, is to also determine those professional development pathways. So how do we provide our general ed teachers with some second language acquisition competencies so that they can work with the EL learners that are in their classrooms? Develop some common understanding of language instruction, educational programs or LIEP types, and how to implement them effectively. And then to disseminate state English learner program requirements to increase impact at school, complex area, and state levels. And then our long-term recommendations was to improve that equitable and adequate funding to support success, to support the recruitment of teachers and support staff to address the needs of distinct populations, and really looking at their home languages, right? To promote differentiated professional development aligned with high-impact curriculum resources that assist with the pathways, right? To begin to implement bilingual programs, and then strengthen those partnerships with the community-based organizations and parents and families, like we heard in the testimony. So that's the recommendations we came up with. If you can turn to the, I think it's page 6 in the final report. So another piece that the task force looked at our last meeting was, as we reflected on the work that we did, we ran it through and thought about school design, which is our way of implementing the strategic plan, right? So we looked at, as the task force, we looked at our core values and mindsets through our beliefs. We looked at if that's what we believe, then what are the kinds of programs or approaches we should have within our schools, and then what would be some of the infrastructure. So what we did was, in our report, we kind of added an example. So if a school at the state level took a look at that core value or mindset of all educators are teachers of language, right? And like special education, it's not just the teachers, right? It's our administrators. We have a lot of part-time teachers working with our EL, so how do we consider them and use them as supports? So as I run through this school design, I'll share with you like a school thought. So if you can engage with me and kind of reflect on if this is what our schools are looking at or possible looking at, what would that impact in turn be with your board work, okay? So if our core value is all educators are teachers of language, right? And so we looked at the curriculum and learning design, which is the next quadrant. We kind of looked at making sure that we had appropriate language instruction educational program types, or LIEP, and language development strategies are implemented in classrooms to address student-specific language development needs. Okay, and if that's our curriculum and design, what are some infrastructures we need to help support that? So educators receive appropriate professional development, and that's why the term is not teachers, because it's all of our people, or all of our educators, right? Admins included. Support language development for English learners in their classrooms. And then teachers will discuss appropriate language development strategies while addressing the needs of English learners during their data team process. So as they're looking at how students are progressing, right? Those who are getting it, what can we do? Those who aren't, what else can we use, right? And then in regards to then, if those are in place, what do we want from our students in terms of their learning products and student voice? So students are able to present their learning in the language of their choice, using supports appropriate for their language development needs. Right? So as we think about school design, and as we think about a school looking at designing around bilingualism or multilingualism, this might be a process or thinking that they can use. And then the next page talks about a learning organization. And really our goal is that equity and excellence. So we looked at that as our main task for the task force, and then possible school designs through that meeting. And really then, how do we start piloting or creating those pilot projects to support what we want to see happening within our schools? So,
any questions?
Yeah.
If not, we'll turn it over to the superintendent.
So I want to thank both of our committees for the tremendous work that they did. One of the, I think, points of conversation very early on was trust the process. to bring a task force together with lots of passionate educators who are really smart thinkers and are focused on students. There are lots of approaches that everyone had and ideas that they had at the task force level. And how are we going to, in a few months' time, get from all of the things that we want to put on the table to a set of recommendations? And so my pushback was trust the process and synthesize into a very short report that's going to be utilized to put the details of implementation. And I just thank everyone for working through that process and teaming in a way that produced, I think, some really good recommendations. I want to just speak to a couple of things that I see a need for immediately. One is I had mentioned that there are some programmatic funds that are held at the state level that I'm looking at as we need the time to build the system in terms of the change for allocating funds and tracking and having a tracking system, and looking at that for a 2019-20 presentation. 2020 rollout. In the immediate, what are some funds we can make available so that schools and complexes can start some of this work? And so we're going through a review internally right now and identifying where we can switch the accountability and the utilization and rollout of funds from the state level to an allocation by complex level based on their students. The other piece is a need to really explore how we provide the differential pay for the time that's needed for teachers to be able to come together and design and plan for our students. And so that will take some conversation about how to make that happen and to provide a financial model that we're going to have to put before the legislature to help us fund this. The other piece is a specific and targeted teacher recruitment approach that's needed, and this is something that we will be very focused on. It's an outcome of the TECC recruitment and retention plan, with higher education being committed to really helping us to put this together. And I will also state that part of our work next year is to clarify what you as a board want to do in terms of approving. I'll put before you a plan for your discussion and consideration of how we are funding at the tri-level using existing funds, but also what are we going with to the legislature with in terms of a specific ask to keep advancing this and having a task force recommendations and an implementation plan that articulates what we need and why we need this. And then finally, I want to just close with saying that one of the things that really strikes me, especially on the EL side, is that as we build this continuum, a support service for English language learners all the way through advancing the work of biliteracy, we want to make sure that we do not kind of condense this together. There are very specific needs that English language learners need to have in terms of very specific supports. And so we're going to be very focused on doing that work and building that system while we're looking at the biliteracy through another and separate task force that's looking at that, advancing and continuing that work. But we don't want to water down looking at the specific needs of our English language learners who need to access the curriculum. At a high level, our curriculum is very rigorous, and if language is keeping them from doing that, then we have to target our supports in that area. So I'll close with that, and I just want to thank not only the task force members, but members of the public who have been very much involved with providing feedback tonight and testimony tonight, but also throughout the year that I've been here, and also prior to my arriving. These are two areas that I know have been long-standing. And so I asked you to give me the time to get the task force focused on recommendations, and I thank you for working with us through that process. And now we go into next year with very specific things that we need to deliver on now. And so I'm fully committed to pushing this implementation at a very high rate of speed, and also lots of thought leadership dedicated in these areas. And I also thank members of the public who came out and said we have some capacity to add to really support this work, and I'll be tapping all of that capacity. So thank you.
Any questions, comments? If not, we'll move to public testimony on board agenda items. This is